Hi everyone and welcome to session 4 of this short course. In this session, we're going to be looking at how to make TikTok work for our brand. Now, I'm joined by a familiar face with Alfie from the MediaWorks team. Hi Alfie.
Yep, hello.
Thanks for joining us again. Now, in this session, it's really about looking at TikTok from a strategic perspective, I guess. So, previous session you joined us with, for me, some of the biggest takeaways were how nicely kind of TikTok lends itself from that organic to that paid perspective. And I feel as though we ticked a lot of boxes there in understanding how we can use, the same content, similar content, similar practices from other platforms on TikTok to get the most of that, again, from that paid perspective. Now, in this session, I guess because we are coming to the close of the short course now, to revisit some of the ideas maybe we discussed earlier on in the short course, to see kind of where we are at now and maybe get your perspective and some of the ideas from the other speakers. But also, again, just to understand how do we go about using TikTok quite objectively with a purpose in mind. It's not something that we jump on just simply because it's the latest, greatest trend. So the first question I have for you then, a really, really broad one, so quite a difficult one is, in your opinion, why should we even be considering TikTok?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's one of those where, like you say, is it just because it's the latest, greatest trend? And is it just because it's something that's kind of stirred up the market in terms of social media? I think that once was the case. And when it first launched, it was crazy. And we've seen some crazy statistics. Like globally, TikTok is set to overtake every other social media channel. It's already beaten YouTube. It's already beaten Snapchat in terms of monthly users. And it's catching up quite aggressively to Meta. So that, I think, was the turning point when people started to think, oh, okay, well, it's here to stay. It's not really just as much of a fad as we all thought it was, because, ultimately social media channels can be like that. Excuse me. We've seen Snapchat drop off quite heavily. And that was one that actually we didn't really expect to drop off. We always thought that there was always going to be a use case for it in terms of a social media channel. And don't get me wrong, there still is. But from an advertiser's perspective, it's not really where you want to be at the moment. TikTok is overtaking it and has done. So I think that's your reason, is that it's become a lot more solidified in terms of its users. Like, people are expanding in terms of the age range and the average age that's using the app. That's growing and growing slowly, and we're starting to see, older demographics using the app and even younger people starting to enjoy it. So it's becoming a much more all-encompassing channel. So there will be a point, I think, where pretty much every brand doesn't have to use it, but will benefit from using it.
Now, in that TikTok targeting, tongue twister, in that TikTok targeting session that we had together again, we were drawing similarities and differences between organic and paid. Now, again, appreciate that your background, your expertise, I guess, is within that paid area. But again, it made sense to have that discussion about organic and paid, simply because it does lend itself quite nice. And I think one of the takeaways from that session for me was it's certainly worthwhile using both of those approaches together to get the most out of your paid activity as well. So I guess the next question would be, how do we go about setting objectives when it comes to the use of TikTok, whether that be organically or in fact paid?
Yeah. So I think, again, very much similar to other channels, but I think the first question you have to ask yourself, whether you're a brand, whether you're working with a brand, or whether you're, solely just doing it for yourself, is, what's your end goal? What do you want? So is it revenue that you need? Is it leads that you need? Or is it just purely awareness? So that's the first thing. Always define your goal. And I think that applies to every channel really, but, still applies very much so to TikTok. So that's your first step in understanding where you are going to want to be. Next is kind of a time frame. So realistically, how quickly do you think you could get there? Or how effectively do you think you could get there? And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to define exactly where you want to be metric-wise by day 28 of month 2. I'm not saying you have to kind of define it that much, but it just gives you a solid idea of, or a gauge, let's say, or a benchmark of where you want to be. I think then thirdly is your understanding of it as well. Who do you want to target and why do you want to target them? So from a paid perspective, part of our planning process and some of the stuff that I do day to day is that forecasting element. So you can use very useful, we have a couple of useful tools that, TikTok, but not necessarily native to TikTok, but the reach and frequency planner is something that allows you to build out your audiences on the Ads Manager platform. And what it will then do is generate a CPM view and an average frequency. CPM being your cost per mil or cost per thousand impressions, and frequency being the average amount of time that someone is going to see your ad. So those two metrics can start to give you a gauge of, one, how much it's going to cost, and two, how much budget you can start to put behind it. So if your frequency of your audience, because it's really small, is 11, then you're not going to really want to run those ads for too long, because if someone's seeing your ad 11 times a day, then they're probably not going to like your brand by the end of the week. So you can start to kind of get gauges of, well, my audience is quite small, therefore I don't think I can actually put that much budget into it, because we're going to start getting creative fatigue. People are going to start having negative conceptions. So that is the third step, I would say, is really start to kind of put the wheels in motion. So start experimenting with those targeting types. And then the fourth is just to test and learn, always test and learn, something that we preach very heavily within our team. The test and learn strategy, and being able to reflect on what's happened across the month. So let's say I run a campaign, there's kind of three aspects that we're looking at. Total metrics benchmarked against our target. So like we said, that time frame and those expected results that we were talking about just a second ago, how close are we to them and how effectively did we reach them? Second of all is our demographic insight. So TikTok, again, another really useful tool is, and something that they've actually really started to put a big push behind recently, is the demographics and the insight you can gain into your ads as well. So you can start to get a full list of the top interests of people that are purchasing or engaging with your ad, and then start to kind of match them up. Yeah. And then third of all, I think, is kind of effectiveness. Again, kind of very much similar to the first one. What's changed since we've launched the ad? So has our CPM gone up? Because that can indicate that, there might be a competitor in the market. There might be someone else running ads with 10 times the amount of budget in the same audience. And then you can start to really make informed decisions based on that. But I'd say they're the kind of main aspects that we look towards from a planning side of things.
And I guess from an objective setting standpoint then, like the importance of actually setting those objectives and making sure that you do have an idea of benchmarking, etc. And also, like you said, looking at how your current content, whether that's organic, whether that's paid, how it's currently performing as well, and always being aware of that and feeding that back into the objective in the first place and what that target is. I guess that's massively important, because being realistic, like something that we've had a conversation about previously is, if I was to come to you and say, right, Alfie, I now want to run paid ads on TikTok, and then I come back to you a week later and say, right, well, why haven't I got 10 million followers, or why hasn't, right? Like, why am I not seeing a massive return on investment here? Like, what do we need to be aware of from that perspective then? So when we set those objectives, like you said, we need to have some kind of time scale in mind, but how do we know what that might look like?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I don't think there's a couple of ways really that you can look at it. So I think it depends on the information that you have beforehand. So if you have a forecast in hand, and if you know how to forecast for audiences, then you've got a much better idea of what you're looking towards, and then you can gauge that on a time frame. So let's say I forecasted and I saw £10,000 generates me, based on my figures, 20 conversions or something. I'd say it's a really high value conversion because that's quite low, but then we can start to look, okay, well, we've only got a monthly budget of £1,000, so it's probably going to take us 10 months to get there. That's likely what we're looking towards. Now, in a lot of people's cases, you don't have that ability and you don't have those metrics behind you. So you're going to have to start to look towards what you can kind of, how to align it with business goals. It becomes a much wider topic of conversation. I think ultimately, you're never going to know exactly what you're going to get from it. And I know that can scare a lot of people, and I get that. But in order to combat that, what you can start to look to do is just consistent monitoring of campaigns. So ensure that you're checking the right things. So kind of a tick list that I'd like to follow is, okay, well, how much does it spend comparative to the budget that I've put in? So because one thing that we can do is we can set a daily budget of £70, but if it's not spending that full budget, then there might be an issue with the size of your audience. Again, CPMs. So CPM is such an important metric, and something that I think a lot of people overlook, because it can indicate so many things, like fluctuations in market conditions. So like I said earlier, someone else might have come in and started running ads with 50 grand a day behind them in the same audience as you. They're going to take the market share, and that's when you start to have to look down to other avenues. And then overall benchmarks as well. So, what a lot of people can do is, if you on simply just a Google search, you can start to find benchmarks by industry of certain metrics. So that's something that we do look towards quite a lot as well. So what's your average click-through rate in
the fashion industry on TikTok, you can find that very easily, and there are a lot of sort of outlets that you can start to look towards, and then you can use that as your benchmark as well. So I think comparing is a massive part of it, and being able to kind of draw up those comparisons is always going to give you a lot of ammo to move forward with, I think.
Absolutely. Right, so now we understand the importance of setting objectives and perhaps how we can set those objectives as well. And I'm also aware of we're naming a lot of kind of tools and resources as well in these live sessions as we're going through. So what we'll do is we'll kind of curate a bunch of links and we'll share them with the learners as well, so they can continue the learning in their own time, of course. But what I want to move on to next is, how do we actually plan our TikTok activity? So we have our objectives. We've identified who our audience is, where our audience is, the best ways to create that content, etc. But then, now what do we do with that?
Yeah, that's fair enough. So I think let's split it into two, and let's talk a bit about organic first. So I think organic is all about content calendars, really. Whilst, like we say, my remit is paid, I think with TikTok you kind of have to have a bit of knowledge of both. So for me, aligning your content and exactly when you're posting it is the most important aspect of TikTok for organic, but kind of a secondary aspect of that is creating this baseline of content. So something that we see on TikTok and not other channels, and something we've discussed in that previous session, was that the reactive element is much more stressed on TikTok. So in order for you to do well organically, you kind of have to use the app as well. So it's not somewhere where you can kind of access TikTok on a, I don't know, bi-weekly basis, dump 5 clips or 5 bits of content and then leave it, because the interaction element's really important. And actually understanding what's going on the app at the time is also important, because if you can't understand that, and if you're not kind of immersing yourself, I suppose is the correct way to put it, then you're not going to be able to jump on any trends that you might see. And that's a really, really easy way to get your followers up and get your kind of your relevancy on the app up as well. So establish a baseline level of content. So plan that out separately. Let's say 4 to 5 posts a week if you can, or whatever works for you. And then start using the app outside of that time. And then if you ever see an opportunity, jump onto it as quick as possible, because I think that's where that planning element kind of saves you. It's almost that fail safe where you've got content you're pushing out, but you've also got the opportunity to be able to participate in trends as well.
Yeah, I think there's an important one as well with trends is to be selective of the trends that you jump on.
Yes. Yeah.
Purely from a brand point of view as well, to think about tone of voice, to think about how that then reflects on your brand as well. Because I can only imagine how many conversations happen between perhaps a brand manager and a social media team. For that social media team to be jumping on trends which aren't particularly aligned with what the brand is trying to put out there about themselves. But there are instances where we've seen some brands seen massive success on TikTok. So what are some of those brands that perhaps you've seen? Because I know that you're definitely a much more frequent user of TikTok than I am.
Yeah, I think there's a couple standout ones that I always tend to look towards when people ask me. The first one is Duolingo. Something that I'd urge everybody, if you've got a TikTok account and you haven't heard of Duolingo on there, or you haven't seen their videos, then go ahead and look at it. But their rate of growth was insane. So I think in September 2019, they started on X amount of followers, but they did 159,999% growth in follower count in under 3 months. Now, the thing is, when people go viral like that, there's obviously going to be a stroke of luck to it. I think there's no denying that. But their content strategy and the way they push content is actually really interesting to look into. So when they first started, the frequency of their content was massive. So I like talking in that 3 to 5 posts a day range. But now if you go on their account, 2 to 3 posts a week max, because they've got such a large following and that baseline following that they don't actually need to prospect, I suppose. I know it's not probably the term for prospecting, but they're not really looking for more followers because they don't really need them. I think they're at about 50 million followers now. And then secondly is Ryanair. I think, has always been a brand across all social media that we've studied for a while, just because of how interesting their take is to sort of their own consumer base. Their Twitter is quite funny to scroll through if you ever fancy a laugh. Just the way they interact with their consumer base. I don't recommend all brands do that, if I'm honest, but their TikTok's kind of very similar in that sense. And again, crazy follower count and crazy growth in the time that they've been using it. So 2 really interesting brands to look at. I think last of all, look at football clubs. Like if you're into football, then look at what they're doing as well.
they've really made a conscious effort, a lot of football clubs, to kind of self-analyze themselves, I think, and almost like be able to joke about their poor performance on in certain matches and stuff. So yeah, I think they're all prime examples of being able to use the app for what it's known for, and that's the entertainment value and the shock value of it. You know, Ryanair isn't necessarily the most exciting. I mean, you know, in terms of the alignment of it, holidays and airplane travel, it's not necessarily something that actually probably aligned with the app at first, but look at them now.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. I think it's a really interesting one as well to understand how TikTok as a platform fits within that wider environment of platforms, because I think the influence of TikTok can be seen on other platforms as well, where, like you said, Ryanair, the TikTok, the Twitter, etc., all follow that tone of voice. But I'll see instances, again, I'm the biggest user of TikTok, but I'll see instances where I'm seeing that kind of TikTok-esque content now bleed into other platforms as well, which is just a really interesting observation. And something else that you mentioned there as well, you know, as much as a Duolingo, when you were just saying, you know, it's a stroke of luck, I was thinking, oh dear, I was expecting the mascot off Duolingo to appear in the window and, you know, start shouting abuse. But I think it's a really important point, because we can create the best content, we can have the best strategy in place, we can plan the best that we can. And yes, with that, we would expect to see the results and the performance that we're looking for. We're going to get into that shortly. But at the same time, we shouldn't necessarily set out expectations to become the next Duolingo as well. So I think there's a really important point to make as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's it's a really good point. There's a certain aspect and element of TikTok where, I hate to say it, but quantity over quality in some instances. Your content on TikTok being a bit rough around the edges is actually quite good, because it seems a lot more natural. And that is one of the main focuses that I'd definitely recommend, is try and act natural. You know, like, it doesn't have to be super, very like businessy and very like following the correct tone of voice. You can kind of think a bit outside the box on it, because that's what people like. And something that I've always said and recommended is try and take the brand away from the person behind the account. And a lot of brands do this. When they interact with consumers like a person, rather than saying the kind of standard copy and paste, thanks for your message, ! Any info, please email. They don't do that. They talk to people like the person behind the account's human as well. So give it that human feel, and see how it goes, because I can definitely see it working in a much more positive fashion than it would if you applied the same strategy that you used on, let's say, Meta.
Yeah, you made a really good point in the previous session as well, which I've been thinking about since then, which was the fact that TikTok almost merges kind of the approach that you'd have for YouTube, that creative side and creative element, with something like a Meta for the targeting and that paid perspective, that paid aspect. And that's something that stuck with me, because I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it, especially for those of us who maybe aren't accustomed to TikTok, or at least accustomed to the paid element of TikTok as well, to think about, right, well, what is this similar to? Where have we seen certain cues or certain approaches elsewhere, which maybe we can now bring into this platform as well? But for me, like, definitely just seeing the way that these brands are using TikTok as a platform, again, massive kind of asset for their brand team as well, to be seen in maybe a different light as well. Like you said, with the example of Ryanair, like, that flight is not the most exciting part of your holiday. No. You know what I mean? It's part of it. But they've managed to make it somewhat exciting and somewhat fun, and having a conversation about that, which is something which I personally haven't necessarily seen achieved to that degree on other platforms. So I think it's a really interesting one, purely from observation, to have seen the type of content come from that platform and what's been successful on that platform. And I think all of this just ties into the user as well. Yeah. You know, going all the way back to the first session that we had in the short course, who is the user? What do they expect from that platform? What do they expect from brands? And like you said, not creating that corporate content, that's not necessarily what they want, is it?
No, not at all. And no, I think you make a really good point. Like, something that we say, and it might sound a bit cliche, but if you are on TikTok, like, try and just have a bit of fun with it. Like, if you're seen as a brand to just be using the app for what it is about, and that is about having fun, then I can guarantee you that you will do better than somebody that's got this like strict regimen of super tight brand guidelines. I understand some brands have to follow that, and I get that completely. I'm not saying that content like that wouldn't work on the app, but 9 times out of 10, the person that's genuinely just using the app for a bit of fun as a brand and is seen as using it like that is going to do better, because that's what Ryanair do, and that's what a lot of other brands have done, and that's what we've seen. So I think that's always something to keep in mind.
And it's also important to bear in mind as well, just tied into what we've discussed previously in this session, how is that content or that piece of content or that style of content going to help you achieve that objective as well, I think, because again, the point of going viral on any platform, but TikTok in this case, is what are you actually going to achieve from that? And how's that going to fit into that overall strategy? Because that idea of going viral, it probably isn't realistic for a lot of brands. Well, it isn't. Otherwise, being viral wouldn't be a thing. It would just be the norm, right? So it's not realistic, and perhaps it's not important. It's not what you're looking to do. It's just to simply gain a massive following. Well, now what? What are we actually trying to get from that? I think is really, really important as well. So that ties into my next question for you, which is, right, we've set our objectives. We've started to plan our activity. You mentioned creating kind of a schedule, a calendar. So before we move on, in fact, can we schedule posts on TikTok?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can schedule posts just like you can on Facebook, Instagram. You can also schedule a number of things from a pay perspective. So
something that we didn't actually touch on, again, this is transferable to Meta, is day parting. So from a paid side of things, what we can start to do is we can only run our ads during specific parts of the day. Now, how much that applies to your brand is something that you kind of got to really sit down and think about. So something we've seen with e-com brands is we'll measure through something like GA, we'll measure exactly where the peaks are in their activity, and we can schedule budget changes so that we're spending 4 times as much during those. So let's say a clothing brand that we work with has its most users on site and highest conversion rate between the hours of 6 and 9 p.m. Okay, so what we can then do is schedule budget changes every day so that it's spending £20 or £20 between the hours of 12 a.m. and 6 p.m. And then once we hit 6 p.m. to 9 p.m, we'd like triple that budget,
right?
Because you're capitalizing on those gains then, and you're getting the best users to site, and you're likely going to see a bit of a spike in conversion rate and higher profitability metrics. So from a paid side of things, that's what we can do. And then organic, of course, you can schedule posts as well.
All right, that's really interesting. So now that we've planned our content, we've scheduled our content, we understand what we're going to spend, when we're going to spend that, what do we need to be aware of now that we're actually executing and we have that content, we have those ads running on TikTok?
Yeah, I think in terms of organic and paid, it's very similar in the sense that part of the execution of your content and your delivery is just the monitoring aspect. So there are certain metrics which, like we say, we'll get into. But I think in terms of once you've launched your ads, once you put your posts out organically, what you're starting to look towards is that initial traction. So, let's start with organic, right? So TikTok is fast. You'll know if a post is going to do well within about the first hour of it being out. Now, this is complete theory and a bit of guesswork from me, but I've been behind some accounts on TikTok before, and I've done a lot of organic work, outside of any other, like working with brands, just on my own. I think that it brackets it essentially. So what happens is, now again, please take this as theory purely, but it feels like this, where in the sense that you'll put a post out and you'll see the initial views go up, and dependent on how many people interact it keeps it on people's For You pages, which is the main feed. For anybody that doesn't know, it's just essentially the feed. It's called the For You page, and it will keep it on there for longer, so it generates more views, and it kind of hits these threshold points. That's just what it seems like, very much so. So you'll be able to gauge it very quickly whether or not a post is going to do well, because you'll see the like to view ratio will either be incredibly large or the gap will be big, which is obviously not as positive. And the smaller that gap is, the more engaging the video is. From a paid perspective, it's slightly more different. It's a bit of a slower process, right? So initial metrics to look at would be, I wouldn't look at any percentage-based metrics for the first at least couple of days, purely because it might have generated, 100,000 impressions or let's say 1,000 impressions and 10 people have clicked on the ad. That means that your click-through rate's incredibly high then, because of the relative volume. But I kind of look at your initial CPM, make sure that that's in the place it was before, and then the paid kind of measurement and execution part really starts to kick in after the first week or so. Right. That's when you'll start to kind of see, okay, well, our click-through rates are 2%. That's really positive. Right, that's really good. Let's go back to those benchmarks we talked about. We're above the industry benchmark. So paid takes a lot longer than organic. It's an interesting one because organic takes longer to plan, I think, from a content perspective, but it's almost over within the hour if it needs to be, which can be disheartening. And I understand why people put out some posts sometimes and think, wow, it's not working, but just keep at it. And from a quantity perspective, ensure that frequency is really high. But yeah.
And then it's also important, like we've said previously, to bear in mind trends, interaction, engagement, etc., between the brand and the user as well. So why is that so important?
So again, links back to that kind of comparison to YouTube, the community aspect in it, and being able to participate and be a part of the TikTok community. And it's slightly cringe way to put it, but kind of interact with other users on the app and ensure that you're participating in trends shows your brand in a light that you know what you're talking about on the app. And even though we can see the average user of TikTok are changing, Gen Z can be a bit brutal sometimes, and that's just the reality of it. So if you kind of look wrong on the app, and if you're just posting recycled content from Meta and you're not actually actively participating in trends, or even just interacting with other brands on it, we see other brands comment on other people's videos, and that's a level of trend participation. I'd say you don't have to be dancing in front of a camera or anything. Like, I'm not trying to scare people out of using TikTok like that, but
damn, that's my plan at the window.
Yeah, I think I'd say I'd bracket stuff like literally interacting with other people as trend participation. So it just shows your brand in the most positive light possible, I think, and that's the kind of bottom line of it.
I think we've touched on this already with the responses you've just given us for the last question, but metrics and measuring success, measuring performance. What do we need to bear in mind? Because we have referred to previously kind of top of funnel activity, bottom of funnel activity, how we might align our content, our activity, our paid campaigns, etc., for different reasons, for different objectives, etc. But what are some of those metrics we then need to bear in mind as well?
Yeah, so I think the best way to kind of run over this is let's split it out by the funnel, right? So if we start right at the top of the funnel for awareness, then very similar metrics again to the other paid social channels, sorry. So we'd be looking at overall reach, which is the amount of unique people that you've reached, your impressions, which is the amount of times your ad has been served. So the difference between impressions and reach is that you can have, if someone views my ad and then views my ad again, that's 2 impressions. If someone views my ad, then views my ad 3 more times, it's 1 reach level. Yeah. It's 1 sort of effective reach. So your reach is always going to be lower than your impressions. The other sort of awareness-based metric I'd look at is CPM. I know we've spoken about that quite a lot, but that kind of gives you your indication of any market fluctuations. When I say market, I'm referring to audience. So within your audience, what's the CPM looking like for that? And then finally, I think one that's a bit more native to TikTok, because it can kind of fall under consideration, is engagement and watch time. So we can see how many people are watching the video that you've put out to 25%, 50%, 75%, and then completion. So if your percentage of people that are dropping off after 25% is really high, then that's actually a really solid indication that potentially the content you're pushing out isn't right, or it's not aligned with your audience.
So just on CPM then,
yeah,
like you said, we've mentioned this so many times with the short course, but just to go a little bit deeper into that, what is CPM and why is that, such an important metric?
So CPM is cost per mil, or cost per 1,000 impressions, essentially. So how much it's costing you as an advertiser, to reach or generate 1,000 impressions. Now, that is determined based on the targeting and your optimization. So the first aspect let's run over is targeting. So if you have a really niche audience, then your CPM is likely to be higher because it's smaller and more people will be competing for it. So, one thing you have to take into consideration across any paid platform, is that multiple advertisers are running ads in the same audience as you. You don't necessarily know it, and there's no metric to really figure that out. But the likelihood of that being the case is incredibly high. So you are competing, and it is a competition in a sense, and stuff like budget, engagement, or how engaging your content can all heavily contribute to fluctuating CPM. So it's something that's really important because it's essentially the central metric for any campaign that you're running. Now, the other aspect is your optimization. So the further down the funnel you go, this is the best way to look at it, the more expensive your CPM is going to be. Now, the reason for that being is because the ultimate end goal is higher in value. So an impression isn't worth as much as a conversion. Yeah. So that's the only other thing that's affecting it. So it's worth keeping that in mind as well, because if you're running a I don't know, a conversion-based campaign and you're wondering why your CPM's at £6, that's probably a solid reason. But those two things work in conjunction with each other. So yeah, I think any advertiser really needs to keep an eye on CPM and not overlook it as much. It's something that, to be honest, if I'm being 100% honest, I used to overlook it quite a lot. And ever since I've started paying way more attention to it, I found it a lot easier to actually understand trends.
Right. Okay, so that's kind of the top of funnel activity, top of funnel metrics I need to be aware of. Now, as you start to move throughout that funnel, what kind of happens in the middle there then?
Yeah, so kind of the consideration level, we're looking at traffic, overall traffic, sending people to site. Now, like I said before, we kind of had that discussion around the consumer journey on TikTok. We tend to not try and send people off the app. However, if you're running a traffic optimized campaign, you're only going to be hitting people, or TikTok is going to be making sure that the only people you're hitting are likely to click on the ad and want to click on the ad. So 3 main metrics I'd be looking at is 1, click volume, so total number of clicks on ad. Now, it doesn't tell the full story, but you know, a high click volume is always a positive thing. The second is a landing page view. So it is very similar to a click in the sense that it, you know, someone clicking on an ad and viewing the website is a landing page view. The difference is, and the reason why it's slightly more important, excuse me, than a click, is a landing page view is only recorded when somebody fully loads the page. Right. So someone clicks on the ad and fully loads the page. Now, if someone clicked on the ad and before it had even loaded, went back, that's still a click. Mm-hmm. So it's a slightly more refined version of a click essentially. And then third of all, a more kind of percentage based is a click-through rate. So the rate at which people are clicking through. So that's your impressions divided by your total, or your clicks, divided by your total number of impressions. Mm-hmm. So essentially out of the 5 million impressions, how many people have actually gone on to click on the ad. So that's slightly more, I think it tells a bit more of a story, and you can put a bit more faith in click-through rate over click volume. Because if I've spent £1 million on an ad, then my click volume is naturally going to be high, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the rate of which people have clicked through is a positive. So they're the 3 I'd be looking at for consideration.
Okay, cool. And then finally, kind of bottom of funnel activity, and also just, I know of course you will cover this yourself, but you know, in the first session we were discussing, is it always about conversion? Is the bottom funnel always about conversion? And we've had this discussion so many times with you as well. And some of the examples that even you provide within the short course have been for maybe an e-commerce brand, right? Now, again, what are some of the metrics at the bottom of the funnel, and do they always relate to a transaction?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. They don't. I think the quick answer to that is a conversion for me, at least. I mean, I suppose there's blanket terms and other definitions, but for me, it would be the most valuable goal towards your business at that current time. So if I was a B2B company and I wanted people to inquire about my engineering services or something, then a lead would be the most valuable conversion at that time. That is still bottom of the funnel because it's the most valuable thing that we can generate. If I was an app, then my most valuable conversion would be an app install. So there's a lot of other, you know, things that you can define as a conversion. It doesn't necessarily have to have revenue attached to it. So something that we saw and we've used before as a case study across some of our, you know, events that we run for the marketing mixes at MediaWorks was Twig, which was a kind of like a marketplace-based app, and they ran an app install campaign. So they optimized towards people installing the app on TikTok, and they did 266,000 app installs, a 50% conversion rate on TikTok. So you can actually go and view that. If you go onto TikTok success stories, you can start to view, you know, all types of different content and how people have used the app for what they kind of value the most towards their business. But I think in terms of blanket metrics to look at for the conversion aspect and the lower funnel aspect, volume of said conversion. So that could be a transaction, that could be an app install, that could be anything, a lead. So the total volume, your cost per acquisition, so how much it's costing you to get that conversion, and then finally the rate at which people are sort of converting, so conversion rate. But again, that when I say conversion, I don't mean a transaction necessarily. It can be anything, a lead, an app install, or a transaction.
Good stuff. So I think we've covered a lot within this session. Now, for you, what are the key takeaways for our learners to go away and start to think about and implement within their TikTok activities? Okay,
so I think we'll split it out by organic and paid. So starting with organic, the first point I'd say and the key takeaway is always have a rigid structure in place for your content. So ensure that you've got, you know, your next kind of 2 to 3 weeks forward planned at least, if not more. And that way that you've always got a kind of fallback and a baseline level of content posting. And then secondly, again, like, I don't want it to sound a bit cringe, but have fun with it. You know, like we said earlier, it's all about having fun on TikTok, and people can see through it when you're not. You know, people can see through it when you're just posting just for your brand. So interact as much as you can on the app. You know, spend a bit of time on it, have a bit of fun. Like if you can convince your boss to let you have an hour a day on TikTok, then hey, that's a win-win.
So then from a paid perspective, again, what are the key takeaways you have?
Yeah, so I think first one for paid for me would be define your audiences before you run anything. So, you know, do a bit of digging in terms of demographics, try and start to align that with your overall demographics of your brand. And then secondly, I think always monitor your campaigns. So there's no such thing as kind of overly monitoring something. You know, try and read into those metrics and be able to draw up a story of why this metric fluctuated or why this did this. Because that will start to give you so much more context towards why things are happening with your campaigns, I think.
Good stuff. Brilliant. Right, so I think that's the end of this particular session then. So thank you once again, Alfie, and thank you to you guys for tuning in. And I'll see you in the final session, which is next up.